Hello, and welcome back to another conversation we entitled, What's Your Story? Today, we're going to welcome Dr. Seth Pierce, who is with us from Union College. Dr. Pierce is the professor of communication and is the communication program director, I understand. But he's also other things. He's a father, a husband, a pastor, an author, and is been someone who has touched a lot of lives in our church. And we are blessed to have him at Union College, and we are very blessed to have him here. Thank you for carving out some time to come and be with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Why don't we start out like we have with all of our guests, and that is to give us a little bit about where you were born and raised, and a little bit about your parents and your family.
Okay.
And we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so I was born in Rochester, Minnesota, and born and raised in Minnesota, and so I'm a disappointed Vikings fan every year. My dad was a pastor at the time, so we lived in the southern part of the state, and the northern part of the state, in Detroit Lakes, and the Twin Cities area. So yeah, that's where I was born and raised, and still claim Minnesota as my home state, even though I haven't lived there in years.
So you've shared a little bit about your parents. Your father's a pastor. You grew up in Minnesota in a number of parts. What did you learn from your parents or even your grandparents, extended family, about racism?
Yeah, so growing up, there was the standard talks about how we treat everyone equally with respect. I had a grand uncle who was black, and growing up, we have family get-togethers, and they were always a part of the family. Even at my grandfather's funeral, he got up and shared, I was never made to feel less than. So certainly it was modeled for me that we treat everyone equally with respect and kindness. However, there was never like a sit-down talk, like you sit down and have like the talk about the birds and the bees, where babies come from. There was never a sit-down talk outside of maybe a teacher in a classroom when we're going through different units in social studies to really explain this is what racism is, this is how it's been a part of the fabric of American life, this is how different friends of ours have experienced it. There was never anything that formal that happened. So it was a very generic sort of, we treat everyone respectfully, but almost that idea that racism is something back there in the past. It's not really, we don't really have to focus too much on it outside of just being equitable and kind to everyone around us.
Well, one of the things that I've heard a lot among people who are Caucasians, I hear them use the phrase, "Oh, I'm colorblind."
Yeah.
Have you heard that?
Yes.
What do you think of when you hear people say that?
There's a few things when that comes up. I think the first thing for me is I hear the intention of that comment. So when someone says, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, I think the intention is good. What they're trying to say is, I see everyone equally. I treat everybody equally, and that's what I'm striving for, and that's a good thing. However, the impact of that statement is different. It's different in a couple ways. First of all, you have this social construct of race. And so there are people, because of their race, who have gone through different struggles, different pains, sufferings, and their identity is tied to that social construct of race. Their experiences are tied to that. So if I say I'm colorblind, what I've done is I've erased all that. And so if someone has gone through terrible treatment because of the color of their skin, and it's become a part of their narrative, not just personally, but as a family, as a community, and I say, that's great, I don't see that. I've erased all those experiences. It also tells me, as a person who has studied somewhat, in this area, that someone has not studied the way they need to. The idea of colorblind racism is decades old. It's not like we just came up with this statement in 2020. And so when you hear those statements and other phrases that get used, for me, and I'm sure for people of color, it says this is somebody who has really not done the work to understand the issues. And so to summarize, the intention of that comment is equality. the impact of that comment is erasure. And we're not just responsible for our intentions, we're also responsible for the impact we have.
Oh, very interesting. Well, did you go to Maplewood Academy?
I did. I went to public high school.
Okay. Well, growing up, did you see racism? Did it affect your life in any way?
On the immediate level, I have never been treated badly because of the color of my skin, whether it was a policy at school, a law, or schoolyard fights. I've never been targeted because of being white. Doesn't mean I didn't have skirmishes with a variety of people in grade school, whether it was another white kid, a black kid, a Hispanic kid. There's always those arguments, or even coming to fisticuffs in the parking lot or whatever. But this is important, and this is I want to pivot a little bit here with this issue, and differentiate between prejudice and racism, because this is something I think we get tripped up on a lot. Anyone can be prejudiced. There are prejudiced white people, prejudiced black people, prejudiced Hispanics, prejudiced Asian. Anybody can be prejudiced. We all have biases. That's part of the human experience. And so I hear a lot of people saying, well, I've experienced racism because, I was the only white guy here, and, everyone else in my neighborhood was a person of color and they picked on me. I would classify that as prejudice and bullying. Anybody can be a bully, but when we talk about racism, what we're talking about is prejudice plus power. And what I mean by power is that you are in a position to create the laws and the policy that structure society. And historically, in terms of representation, it's been predominantly white people who have had that kind of power. And I say that, and it's going to trigger, people like me probably in two ways. Number one, well, haven't we come a long way? And we certainly have, and we need to celebrate that and rejoice in the progress that we've made. But that doesn't mean we've arrived yet. And so you can celebrate, yes, it is much better than it was, but it doesn't mean we've now arrived at perfection in society, that somehow because we've done away with laws like Jim Crow, we've eradicated racism, or that racism hasn't found ways to morph itself into something else. And so there's that piece of it. The other piece is, are you saying all white people are bad? White people are terrible people, they shouldn't have power? That's not what I'm saying. It's the idea that even if I'm a conscientious white leader, making policies and laws and whatever it is, because I don't know what it's like to be a person of color, I have blind spots. You could ask me to plan a women's retreat, and I could probably do some good things, but there's things I'm going to miss just because I'm not a woman. And so when we're talking about really developing equitable policies and laws and practices, it's important to have that representation there. As a result of my skin color, I've never had issues finding representation, whether it's superheroes in movies or government leaders or pastors. My friends and colleagues who are people of color have sometimes struggled in that way.
Would you very interesting. That was very good explanation of racism when you add prejudice with power. I'd never heard that. I really appreciate that. And I hear this phrase thrown out a lot, systematic racism. Is that the foundation of it? What is your view? What is systematic racism?
Right. So systematic racism, as far as my understanding goes, and this is not the grand, probably the only definition, but it is really looking at the policies, the laws, and social structures and norms we have in place, and saying, because historically, the people who've had the power to shape those things have been white, even if there's been good intentions, at times it doesn't always lead to good outcomes for people of color. And me being a white person, we all have our normals, right? The way we live our life. And I can go through life and things feel fine and normal. It doesn't mean that everybody else has that same experience. And so when I talk to my students or my colleagues who are people of color, and they tell me, or they point things out, this is not always the case. This doesn't affect me the same way. You start to realize that, okay, this normal, these structures we've put in place is working for me, but it's not working for everybody. and that's what they mean. And one of the problems I think we have too, as people who are not persons of color, is when someone points out systematic racism or talks about policies or practices, I immediately personalize it. Oh, you think I'm a bad person? And that's not what this conversation is. We're talking about, we're taking a hard look at society, and as great as America is, as much progress as we've made, we're saying it's still not quite there yet. Let's take a closer look and make sure we can shape things to be equitable for everybody.
Well, what do you see are the biggest barriers of going that extra distance? Of, we've come far, but we've got a ways to go. What are some of the barriers and ways we can overcome them?
I think some of the barriers, just on the interpersonal level, is trust. We have trust issues, and part of that comes with the history behind these policies and practices. If you're someone who has been on the short end of the stick for a long time, to trust that, okay, I'm going to now have this meaningful conversation on race and prejudice with my white friends, but I also know they're online all day long denying that it exists and saying everything is fine. I don't know that I want to have that conversation. As a person of color, if I've been through traumas and pains and struggles that are very hurtful and real and raw for me, and then I take that pain to my white friend or colleague who just erases it and says, no, it's in your head, it doesn't exist. That's not only am I suffering from the initial results of systematic racism, but now this person who I thought was my friend just denied my entire experience. So trust is a big thing. Anxiety is a big one. I think for people who are not persons of color, we have not been taught how to talk about it, racism. And so I am so nervous that I'm going to say the wrong thing or something that's offensive, and I'm going to say that, and then everyone's going to think I'm a terrible person, so I'm just not going to say anything at all. And of course, now we're not dealing with the problem. And so there has to be these healthy relationships rooted in trust, where you can start to have these conversations, and that takes a lot of time. I think the other barrier is ignorance. And sometimes willful ignorance, where you have people who are unwilling to listen to other perspectives. When a person of color approaches them and says, hey, this has been my reality, my experience, I go on the defensive and I in attack mode and try to discredit it, versus being able to sit with that information and listen to my friend or colleague and really learn. Or when someone says, hey, these are some good books and resources and voices that have addressed this issue, being willing to take the time to sit with books, not just YouTube videos, not just, my favorite part is a news media, CNN or Fox News, but to sit down and say, I'm going to do the hard work of reading actual books that I bought on Amazon or got from the library, even if it cost me, late fees. I'm going to sit with this material over a period of weeks and months and longer and really work through so I can understand what's happening, versus just these quick, I read a 300-word microblog and now I'm just going to, or I found the one person of color who agrees with my position. I'm going to use that as a representative to discredit. Yeah.
Wow. So, my journey growing up, though it happened years earlier than yours, was pretty similar. My father worked for the church too. We traveled around a little more. His jobs took him to different states. But we always just junctured with what are called state conferences, which is really, I don't know why we could do that, but we try to differentiate between a regional conference, which is largely made up of African Americans, not all by any means. There's a lot of Hispanic and even Caucasians that go to their churches, but largely, and then you have state conferences. And I hadn't had any interaction with regional conferences. And I didn't even realize all the churches that were all around me that even existed, because our conference didn't work with those churches. It wasn't until I started working with the Lake Union about 8 years ago that I first junctured with a regional conference. the Lake Region Conference. And I began to hear about their history and what it was like for them, why they started, and what the journey had been like for them. And I couldn't believe it, because I had gone all the way through school, all the way through the seminary, and I hadn't heard these stories. Yeah. Have you seen in the church even examples of racism that have been things that as a church we ought to address and look at?
Yeah, even I was reflecting on my experience growing up in church school, and just kind of start there. And I remember we had people of color in my school, not many, but some. And I remember as early as second grade bullying people of color, being caught up, whether it was older kids who do it or it just sort of happened, and doing horrible things, creating mock African dialects, to talk to them, or just standard bullying, shoving around and stuff, and going along, name calling and doing it and feeling like I was part of the crowd. It was very empowering to sort of target this person. In fifth grade, one of my classmates got in front, and there was a map of the world, and pointed the stick and said, "It's going to be a very dark day or black day in Niger," but he pronounced it with a hard G. And the class laughed, and even the teacher chuckled at that. And as I reflect on that as an adult, first I'm horrified and ashamed and deeply sorry that happened. But looking back at that, I realize how easy it is to be socialized into racism. Like you're not even, you may have a sense of what you're doing, it's getting a reaction from someone, from the person you're bullying, but later realizing, you knew it was bad, but then once you get some history and some knowledge, you really understand the depth and the impact of what you're doing. And so it's very easy to grow up with those norms. It's just the way it is. Some of our messaging in the church is problematic. I'm on a pastor's page, and someone has pointed out there was a mailing for one of our ministries that talks about, Christopher Columbus, was he a Bible student of prophecy? And for many people of color, they're like, this was somebody who did incredible damage to indigenous peoples, when he got, when he crossed the Atlantic. And so this is not necessarily someone we want to hold up as, let's explore them in this good light. So there's a few things that you see, and it's not always overt, and that's the other challenge, I think, for white people. When we hear racism, we think overt acts of intentional violence. We don't think of the subtle ways that we exclude voices, the jokes that we might make that might be racist or homophobic or whatever they are. And for me, I'm not the butt of that joke, so I might, not a big deal, I might laugh at it and not realize that this is being heard very differently by people who are not like me. And so it's not just these big things that happen. It's even just day-to-day conversations that take place.
You're a professor over here at Union College. And what can you say about the generation coming up? What do you see different than, say, my generation in terms of understanding the issues surrounding racism?
I think what has happened with digital communication technologies, it's given us access to all kinds of history, all kinds of narratives and stories that maybe in our carefully curated textbooks and official church communications have not been told. And so as people are discovering these things, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we made people use separate drinking fountains, separate sidewalks. And even when that was abolished, we still have all these, other things that took place. Have we ever owned up to that? Have we ever apologized? We're just going to forget about that? That didn't happen. And now, of course, you've got this mindset for many, I'm just speaking generally now, of, we did away with Jim Crow. There's no more racism. Slavery was a long time ago. It doesn't exist. And now this sort of anger and rage saying it does exist, just because you made this illegal doesn't mean now you've done away with racism. It still finds ways to manifest. Can we address it? And because we are so nervous and polarized politically in this country, we hedge a lot on addressing these issues. And you will find that this generation is less tolerant of that. Like if there's an issue, if people are being hurt, you deal with it as a family. You don't pretend it's fine when it's not fine. And so you will see a lot more vocal students calling on their church to say, this can't just be, I don't want platitudes. I don't want aphorisms. I don't want just conversations. I want some action. We are hurting people, which is affecting the mission of the church. Can we please deal with it? And we shouldn't have to get to the point of a demonstration or to make you hear this. We should be proactive with this in dealing with it. So looking at where their hearts are at, and again, I don't want to essentialize students. There's certainly a spectrum of beliefs and thoughts, but when there's an issue, they want to deal with it. And I shared this on Twitter not too long ago. I've been in churches where they'll tell me how they used to have a youth group, but they had a falling out over someone brought in contemporary music or something, and it turned into a big fight, and now that youth room has sat empty for 30 years. And these are issues that will empty your youth room. And in 20, 30 years later, if Jesus doesn't come, do you want to look at that empty room and think it was not worth that fight? We should have listened and done this. And now we've lost a generation of believers.
What can we do more of as a church to promote healing in a healthy dialogue in this area?
First of all, I think just acknowledging it is huge. Just to say, yes, we still have racism and issues in the church that we need to deal with. We have to realize that our theology is not opposed to dealing with issues like racism. I often hear this is a spiritual issue, just preach the gospel and the three angels message and let's not get involved with social justice. And when I hear that, I think you really don't understand the three angels message. You've never read Revelation 14 and 18. And when you look at Revelation 14, first angel spreads the gospel to who? Just white people in America? I mean, every nation, language, tribe, tongue, people, it's everybody. And so on that level, on the first angel's level, we are called to communicate the gospel. If we are communicating in ways that hurt people or that silence people, it's a problem. The second angel says, come out of Babylon. And you compare that to Revelation 18, and it talks about you have this false human-centered religion that has partnered with the state that you need to come out of. Number two, it talks about how there's merchants of the world that have grown rich and just are basking in luxury, which implies that there are people who have been exploited and who are not doing well economically, and all kinds of other crimes and terrible things, and we're called to come out of that. And what I find so interesting is an angel has to tell God's people to come out of that. It's become our norm. So the second angel is telling not just everyone, but us, because we're so used to living in a system that way, to come out of that because it's broken. And then the third angel calls us back to worship God, the Creator, who created everybody in His image, meaning everyone is created in the image of God. And we tend to take the third angel's message in Revelation 14 and talk about the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is about being able to rest and connect and have community. And some people can't do that, with the way society has been structured. It's very difficult. And so to somehow suggest that dealing with racism is a secular social justice issue is a misunderstanding of the implications of the three angels' message. When we are not communicating well and we are not working in ways to free people from broken systems and give people that rest and feeling good that they're created in the image of God, that's a foundational, missional, theological issue that we need to address. And so that's a big thing. We need to quit separating these two things and put them in dialogue together.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you two questions. I've only been asking our guests one of these, but I got to ask you two questions. Okay. What do you wish, or what would you like to say to your Caucasian Seventh-day Adventist members, your fellow members? What would you like to say to that group?
There's a couple things. I mean, there's a lot. And I'm speaking to me while I say this, we have to stop coding any attempt to even talk about racism as somehow Marxist or secular or unbiblical. We have to stop that. We have got to realize it is a biblical issue. It's a gospel issue. It's a missional issue. We need to listen and learn. The other thing that goes along with that is we need to toughen up a little bit. We are so sensitive around this topic. When a person of color works up the strength to try to communicate with you about their experience, what's going on, for me to immediately go on the defensive and make the conversation about me and not about the subject of racism is unhelpful and damaging. We need to learn. I mean, we all struggle with listening in general, but especially in a situation like this where it's so emotionally loaded and has so much history behind it. We have to learn to be able to listen, and not listen to find how we're going to pick apart that argument, but really listen to understand. And the other thing I would say, and again, it's a general human problem, but especially as we're talking about this in the church, we need to stop this practice of looking at whatever movement it is, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, whatever it is, and spending all kinds of time finding the worst possible example we can and holding that up as if it's representative of a movement. We don't like it when people do it to us, so we need to stop doing that. And we need to find the best examples, the most positive examples, and start the conversation there and quit misrepresenting each other. It's terrible that we do that. The other thing to realize is that this is very slow, patient work. Doing the work of dismantling racism is not something you will have accomplished by watching an interview, by watching 24-hour news for a couple of days, by reading one book. This takes a while. It takes a long time to get good information, to build those intercultural relationships that are rooted in trust, and then have those slow, understanding conversations. This is not a quick fix. And so we need to be willing to take the time. And then finally, realizing it is our work to do. I don't get to go to a person of color and say, all right, in this work, do it now for me for free in the next 5 minutes. It's on us to go find those voices that have published, that have written, and do the work, and not expect someone to do it for us.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, excellent list. You said several times right there, and you said earlier that trust has been broken, and trust is not easily rebuilt. It is going to be something that's going to take time, and we'll have to show over and over again we are interested in being anti-racist now. So here's the question I'm going to ask you that I haven't asked anyone else. I asked you what you like to say to those who look like us. What would you like to say to our people of color who might be listening to this?
I think first, it's important to apologize for the things that have been done. The policies, the systems, the treatments, from the interpersonal level to the mass communication level that have minimized and silenced the voices of people of color. And of course, you'll get some theological chatter about that. Well, I'm not responsible for, I didn't personally do anything. But you read the book of Daniel, and Daniel may not have done anything on an individual level, but he still included himself when he prayed to God for forgiveness. And the bottom line is, we all have blind spots, and I have no doubt that there are things that I have done and that I do unintentionally that are hurtful. And just speaking for me, I guess, now I am learning to welcome correction and not coding it as a criticism. But when I have a friend who's a person of color who says, when you said something this way or you did this, it kind of comes across this way, realizing that is somebody who is trying to help me be better, not criticize me. And I need to appreciate it, and I need to take that advice. There's a lot that can be said. The other thing that I want to say as a statement of solidarity is Black Lives Matter. They do. I mean, this isn't meant to be me aligning myself with a political party or a political ideology. This is me saying, certainly, all lives matter. But as we look at the state of humanity now, this is not just an American issue. This racism is everywhere. Recognizing that in this moment, this group of people is being treated in a way that communicates your life doesn't matter or doesn't matter as much. And so that's a statement of solidarity and a statement that I want to do the work to make sure that my friends, my colleagues, and people I haven't met yet who are people of color know that there are people who are working to try to make things better. And we're learning. And not that you owe us this, but please be patient, as we try to do this work.
Well, thank you. I threw you a curveball there, but I appreciate the words you spoke very much. What did I miss? What do you wish I had asked you that I didn't ask?
So maybe let's talk a little bit about the practical steps that the church can take. And I was reflecting on this, and I threw it out to my Twitter friends. I said, look, if you could do anything, what are some practical suggestions? And the biggest, by far, was just really investing in education. They talked about how both pastors and teachers are not currently adequately prepared to get into the classroom or the congregation and talk about issues of racism and diversity. There's just no training there. And I know we're better than we were, but there still needs to be a very intentional effort to give these tools to people. Because if you don't, even if you have someone who has good intentions and wants to say something, if they don't have the training, they can do even more damage by trying to lead the conversation and not know what they're doing. So that has to happen. Another one that came out, and there were several, so I'm just going to focus on a couple, was addressing the Sabbath school lesson. And one of the comments was, stop answering questions that no one is asking. We are dealing with real issues, whether it's racism, sexism, legalism, these kind of things, and we need some very concrete education on how do we deal with the history of racism and how it manifests now, and quit making it so sort of milquetoast, general, platitudinal. We need some good material to engage people, and then creating offices of diversity and inclusion, not just for our colleges and universities, for conferences, unions, divisions. And I say that knowing, having worked for the church as a pastor, now as a professor, that I know budget item, the budget can be thin, but it's important to invest in creating these positions and not just assigning the task to somebody else who has 50 other things on their plate, because they're not going to be able to do the work well. And so it has to be an area of specialty and passion, not just finding somebody who's already in charge of 13 different things. And by the way, now you're also in charge of this, because it won't be done well. So those are areas that we need to practically invest in.
You have been so helpful today, Seth. I want to thank you. You've said some really insightful things that I've never thought of before. And it's a blessing that we have you there at Union College. Thank you, and God bless you on your journey, and thank you for being part of this today.
Thank you.